The parking lot was almost empty. 3 overhead lights still working out of 7, the dead ones carving patches of dark that felt less like shadow and more like intention. Christiana's sneakers hit the asphalt in uneven rhythm, left foot steady, right foot catching. Because she'd twisted her ankle on the stairwell door she'd shoved open 3 minutes ago in pain. She had learned, was something you filed away for later when later was the only goal you had left. Her breath came out in short white clouds. She did not look back. Looking back was how he caught you, not physically, emotionally. You looked back and you saw his face doing the thing it did, the controlled disappointment, the wounded confusion, the silent question of how could you, and your own mind became the cage before he had to build one. 2 years of that. 2 years of being turned around mid-escape by the architecture of her own guilt. Not tonight. Her sneakers hit the asphalt. The cold pressed against the sides of her face like hands. She could hear him behind her. Not running, walking. David never ran. Running was urgent and urgency implied he might lose, and David did not construct a single moment of his life around the possibility of loss. He walked because he had already done the math. No money she could access. No friends left in the city who hadn't been quietly, methodically made to feel unwelcome in her life. No visa that didn't run through paperwork he had positioned himself inside of like a splinter invisible until you tried to move. He walked because he was certain. The hospital entrance was too far. She'd miscalculated the distance in the dark, and the few cars scattered across the lot were locked and lightless, and none of them were hers. The security booth near the east entrance was empty. The one bench outside the sliding doors held an elderly man asleep under 3 layers of coat, and she would not pull someone's grandfather into whatever David would make of the next 5 minutes. There was no one. No one except the man standing at the far end of the lot, near a black sedan, under the one light that still worked properly. Its fluorescent hum carrying across the cold air like a frequency only certain kinds of quiet could hold. She saw the tattoos first. Dark ink climbing his neck, deliberate and dense, disappearing into the collar of a coat that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have never had to think about cost. He was standing still in the way that large, dangerous things stand still, not passive, not resting, simply conserving something. His hands were in his pockets. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. She didn't think. Thinking was the enemy. Thinking was 2 years of maybe he didn't mean it, and maybe it'll be different, and maybe you're the problem, Christiana. Did you consider that thinking was the mechanism David had used to keep her standing in rooms she should have walked out of? So she turned it off. Every alarm in her nervous system pointed in one direction, and she followed it the way her grandmother had always told her to follow the thing that scares you least. She ran straight at the stranger. Her arms went around him. Her face pressed into his chest, and the fabric of his coat was soft in a way that registered somewhere below language, real wool, dense and warm, the kind of material that exists in a different category of the world than anything she'd touched in recent memory. He went completely still, not stiff. Still. The difference mattered. Stiff was surprise becoming defense. Still was something else. A man who had learned to process before he reacted, who kept his responses on the inside until he'd decided what they were. She felt the tension in him like a current. She tilted her head up. His face was sharp at the jaw, composed in a way that looked constitutional rather than practiced, like he had been assembled with calm as a structural material. His eyes were dark and completely unreadable. Not cold. She would realize later that she'd been wrong about that first impression, but contained. Everything in him was contained. He looked down at her without expression. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Please, just pretend you know me. Something happened in his eyes. Not softness, more like recognition. The way a man looks when he has heard a sentence that tells him everything relevant about a situation without requiring translation. He didn't pull away. He didn't push her off. He looked at her for a moment that had weight to it, and then his gaze shifted past her shoulder, and she felt his whole body change. The stillness reorganized itself into something with edges. Here is the thing about women who stay too long in the wrong situation. They don't stay because they're weak. They stay because they've been made to believe their instincts are broken. What Christiana did in that parking lot took more courage than anything she'd done with a man who called himself her protector. Remember that. Christiana. His voice came from behind her, patient, measured, the voice he used in public when he needed witnesses to see the reasonable man and not what lived underneath it. Her grip on the stranger's coat tightened. David's footsteps didn't quicken. They never did. "Baby, whatever this is, let's not. Not out here. Come home and we'll talk." The stranger's hand came up slowly. His fingers touched her waist with a deliberateness that felt like vocabulary, like a man who understood that arriving without warning on a woman's body was its own kind of violence, and who had chosen, in this moment, to ask first. His palm settled more firmly only when she pressed into it. "You know this woman." Quiet voice, accented, Korean consonants moving through English the way water moves through specific channels, finding the direct path, losing nothing along the way. Christiana shook her head against his chest. "Christiana," the patience in David's voice thinned. "I'm not doing this. Tell him right now so we can go." The stranger's other hand came up. Two fingers found her chin and tilted her face upward, not roughly, not with theater, but with the same deliberate permission as before. His eyes moved across her face methodically. Whatever calculation was happening behind them, she couldn't track it. She just felt it. The quality of being genuinely assessed rather than managed. Something in his expression arrived at a conclusion. He looked over her shoulder. "She says she doesn't know you." "That's my girlfriend." David's voice acquired its boardroom register, the one built for rooms where he controlled the definitions. "She's upset. It happens. This has nothing to do with you, friend. Back away and we'll both pretend this didn't happen." "She's holding on to me." Stated like weather, like a man reading a temperature aloud. "I don't believe she wants to go with you." She heard David's breathing change. She knew that sound with the intimacy of someone who had spent 2 years mapping a person's warning signs the way sailors map shallow water, not out of love, but out of survival. "Breathe," the stranger said quietly. Just to her, private inside the cold air, like David's presence was a footnote. She pulled in a breath. It moved through her unevenly, catching on something lodged behind her sternum, but it moved. "Step away from her." David's register dropped. The boardroom voice gone, the underneath voice arriving. "I'm a licensed attorney. I have professional relationships in this city at levels you cannot access. You are holding a woman who belongs with me, and I am giving you exactly one opportunity to correct that." The stranger said nothing. Two men appeared from the shadows at the periphery of the lot. Neither announced themselves. They simply became present, dark suits, absolute stillness, their eyes fixed on the stranger with the particular attention of men awaiting a gravitational signal. He didn't look at them. He kept his focus on the space over her shoulder where David stood. "You should go." "Go," David laughed. Not real. A sound used as a tool. "There are cameras on every corner of this building. You think I don't know where every camera in this hospital is positioned? You cannot touch me here. This is textbook unlawful detention, and I will have your face on a police report before you make it to whatever car you came in." The stranger tilted his head. A small movement. The particular curiosity of someone who has just heard an argument they find genuinely interesting for the wrong reasons. "Call them," he said. "Describe tonight. Tell them you were following a woman through a parking lot. Tell them she ran. Tell them she was frightened enough to hold onto a stranger." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Christiana felt David recalibrate. She knew that silence too, the pause before he switched instruments. "Christiana." "Stripped of all decoration now, just the blade. Look at me." She didn't. "Your visa expires in 6 weeks. I am the person whose name is on your housing contract. I am the professional contact on your university enrollment application. You walk away from me tonight and you wake up tomorrow with no legal standing in this country. No apartment, no academic future, nothing." A beat. "You know I will make sure of that. You know I can." Her throat closed. Because he was right. That was the architecture. That was what 2 years of quiet, systematic work had built. A structure where every exit led to a wall he'd already placed his hand against. The stranger's thumb moved against her neck. One slow circle, anchoring. She's already gone. No heat in it, no performance. The simplest possible statement of a fact he had apparently already decided was true. Leave, don't return to her. David was quiet for a moment that felt load-bearing. You have no idea, he said finally, what you've just involved yourself in. Neither did she, the stranger said, when she met you. The silence after that had a different quality. Christiana felt something shift in the air, not resolution, not safety, but the particular atmospheric change that happens when power in a room transfers hands and the person losing it hasn't fully processed the accounting yet. David looked at her one final time. She made herself meet it. She owed herself that much to see it clearly, without flinching, the last time she was ever going to let it land on her. You'll regret this. He turned. His footsteps crossed the asphalt at the same unhurried pace they'd arrived with, because David would not give the parking lot the satisfaction of a changed tempo. She listened until they rounded the corner of the hospital building and disappeared. The fluorescent light above them buzzed and found its rhythm. Christiana became aware, slowly, that she was still shaking, that her ankle still hurt, that the stranger's hand was still at her waist, steady and present, and that he had not moved or spoken or done anything since David left except remain. She looked up at him. Ya Changmin, he said quietly, not an introduction in the social sense, more like handing her a key before she'd found the door. She didn't know that name yet, didn't know what it meant in this city, or what the two men at the edge of the lot understood it to mean, or why David's final calculation had flickered with something that looked, for just one unguarded second, like fear. She just knew that she was breathing, that her feet were on the ground, that for the first time in 2 years, she was standing in a situation she had chosen. Changmin looked down at her, and something in his expression asked a question he didn't put into words. She answered the one she understood. Christiana Green, she said. Chicago. His eyes moved across her face one more time. Then he looked toward the black sedan. You need somewhere to go. Not a question. A door opened inward, waiting to see if she'd walk through it. And Christiana Green, honors student, survivor, woman who had just run toward the most dangerous thing in the parking lot and found it softer than what was chasing her, looked at the ink on his neck, and the men in the shadows, and the car waiting under the cold soul sky. She thought about what David had promised she'd wake up to tomorrow. Then she stepped forward. She didn't know yet that Ya Changmin had never brought anyone home, that the men at the edge of the lot would spend the entire drive in a silence that meant something she hadn't learned the language for yet, that the world she was walking into had its own rules, its own gravity, its own particular brand of violence. She would find all of that out. But first, the door. The car didn't have a smell. That was the first thing Christiana noticed. Most cars had something fast food, air freshener trying too hard, the particular staleness of a life lived in transit. This one had nothing. Just cool, climate-controlled air and leather so dark it absorbed the passing streetlights without giving them back. The sedan moved through Seoul's night streets the way water moves through a channel it's carved over centuries, certain of its path, unbothered by what it passed. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap like a woman in a waiting room, which was, she supposed, approximately accurate. Changmin sat beside her and looked out his window. The two men in the front, she still didn't know their names, hadn't been introduced. Suspected introductions were not the cultural currency of this particular arrangement, drove without speaking. The one in the passenger seat had not looked at her once since the parking lot. The driver had looked at her exactly once, in the rearview mirror, with an expression she couldn't decode beyond the fact that it wasn't hostile. She watched Seoul move past the glass. She had loved this city once, had arrived 18 months ago with a scholarship deferral, a carry-on, and the specific confidence of a black girl from the South Side who had gone every hard thing she'd ever attempted on merit alone. She'd loved the density of it, the way beauty and infrastructure existed in the same breath, the food, the language she'd been quietly studying for 2 years before she arrived. She had loved it before it became the place she couldn't leave. Now she watched it slide past and tried to remember what it felt like to see it as hers. Changmin said nothing. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. Because here is what people who have never been in a controlled relationship don't understand. Silence from a safe person feels entirely different from silence used as a weapon. One is space. The other is a wall being built around you while you stand there. Christiana knew the difference now in her body the way you know temperature. And the silence in that car was space. The building didn't announce itself. No gate with theater, no architectural statement designed to make visitors feel small. Just a structure in a quieter part of the city, glass and dark stone, the kind of understated that costs more than obvious ever could. The sedan pulled into an underground garage and stopped. The driver was out and had her door open before she'd processed they'd stopped moving. She stepped out. Her ankle reminded her it existed. She didn't let it show. Old reflex, don't let him see where it hurts. She caught herself performing for an audience that was no longer present and felt something complicated move through her chest about that. Changmin was already walking toward the elevator. He didn't look back to check if she was following. Not rudeness, she understood instinctively it was something else. An assumption of autonomy. He'd offered the door. Walking through it had been her choice. He wasn't going to manage her passage. She followed. The elevator was mirrored on 3 sides, and she saw herself for the first time since the parking lot. Her hair had come half out of its braid. There was a small tear at the shoulder seam of her jacket from when she'd caught the door handle escaping. Her left eye had a tiredness behind it that sleep wouldn't fix. The accumulated fatigue of a person who had been on alert for so long that rest had become a theoretical concept. She looked at herself for a long moment. Then she looked at Changmin's reflection beside hers. He was already looking at her reflection, not with the surveillance quality she'd grown accustomed to, that specific way David tracked her in mirrors, cataloging, calculating. Changmin looked the way someone looks at something they're trying to understand without disturbing. When he saw that she'd caught him, he didn't redirect his gaze. He simply held it, acknowledged, and then looked back at the doors. The elevator opened. The apartment occupied the entire floor. Christiana stepped inside and stopped moving because stopping felt necessary. Because the space required acknowledgement, the way certain silences require acknowledgement, as a matter of respect for their scale. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the far wall held souls spread out below them, the city's lights compressing distance into something that looked like scattered gold. The furniture was sparse and exact, a low sofa in dark fabric, a table that held nothing on it, shelving along one wall with books arranged in a way that suggested they were read rather than displayed. No photographs. No decorative objects chosen for impression. Everything present had a purpose she could identify. It looked like a man who had decided exactly what he needed and refused everything else. One of the men from the car, she would learn his name was Woojin, though not tonight, set a glass of water on the kitchen counter without being asked and left through a door she hadn't noticed. The other was simply gone. She hadn't heard either of them leave. Changmin removed his coat and set it over the back of a chair. The tattoos continued down his arms. She could see now, the collar had hidden only the beginning of them. He moved to the kitchen with the ease of a man in the only place where he permitted himself ease, opened a cabinet, and placed a small first aid box on the counter beside the water glass. He looked at her ankle. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't favored it visibly. She was almost certain of that. "How?" she started. "The way you stepped out of the car," he said simply, and turned to fill a second glass. She sat on one of the counter stools and reached for the water and drank half of it before she was aware she'd been thirsty. The kitchen was warm. The counter was cold under her palms, and she pressed into it deliberately, grounding herself in the physical fact of a surface that held her weight without conditions. Changmin set the second glass down and looked at her. Not at her injury, not at the tear in her jacket, at her face. The way you look at a person when you're asking a question you haven't decided to ask aloud yet. "Are you hungry?" The mundanity of it hit her somewhere unexpected. She had braced for questions. Who is he? What did he do? How long? Why didn't you leave? The inventory that well-meaning people conducted with the efficiency of auditors, as though trauma had a ledger that needed balancing in real time. She had not braced for hungry. Her throat tightened. "I don't know," she said honestly. Something in his expression registered that as a more complete answer than she'd intended. He moved to the refrigerator with the quiet efficiency of someone who cooked not for performance, but for function. And she watched him without knowing what to do with the unfamiliar sensation of being in a room with a man and not monitoring the temperature of his mood. And this is where I need you to stay with me, because what's about to happen in this apartment over the next few days is not what you're expecting. Changmin isn't what you're expecting. And Christiana, a woman who came to Seoul with a future and had it methodically dismantled, is about to discover that the most disorienting thing about safety is learning to stop scanning for the exit. He made rice. Simple, deliberate, the kind of meal that made no statement except here is something your body needs. He set it in front of her and returned to his side of the counter and looked at his phone with the focused quiet of a man with a city to manage, and left her entirely alone inside the act of eating. She ate. The apartment held its silence around her. Not David's silence, the pressurized kind, the kind with weather inside it, the kind that had taught her to read atmospheric changes the way a farmer reads the sky. This silence had no agenda. It simply occupied the space between things the way furniture occupied the space between walls. She finished eating, set down the chopsticks, looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gold spread of the city below. I don't have anything, she said, not complaint, inventory. My bag has my phone and my student ID and approximately 4,001. I know. I'm not, she stopped, reorganized. I'm not asking you to fix that. I need you to understand what I'm saying, which is that I have no leverage in this situation. No collateral. No reason you should have done what you did tonight, and no way to make it worth your while that I can currently identify. Changmin looked up from his phone. She held his gaze the way she used to hold gazes before 2 years of being told her eye contact was aggressive had trained the reflex out of her. It took effort she resented having to spend. I'm telling you, she continued, because I think you're a man who respects honesty more than positioning, and because I'd rather know now if there are conditions attached to tonight. The silence after that was different from all the previous silences. It had weight and direction, the way a held breath has weight and direction. Changmin set his phone face down on the counter. No conditions, he said. Simple, no elaboration offered, no performance of virtue around it. The way a man states a fact he finds unremarkable. I'll have someone retrieve your belongings from wherever they are tomorrow. He won't give them up without. He won't be asked, Changmin said. The quietness of it made it more complete than volume would have. Christiana looked at him for a moment, at the ink along his forearms, at the phone face down on the counter with the small red indicators still pulsing at its edge, messages accumulating, the city conducting its business. The machinery of whatever his life actually was continuing to run just outside this kitchen's atmosphere. She thought about what David had said in the parking lot. You don't know what you're getting into. She thought about the men who had materialized from the shadows and waited for a gravitational signal. She thought about the way Changmin had said no to a man like David with the energy of someone setting down a cup of coffee. What do you do? She said. Not a question exactly. More like the beginning of an acknowledgement that she was not naive and preferred not to be treated as though she were. Changmin's eyes didn't change. Many things, he said. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, so brief she might have manufactured it. It isn't. He picked up his phone and stood. There's a room at the end of the hall. It has what you need for tonight. Tomorrow we'll address the rest. He walked toward the far side of the apartment with the same unhurried certainty he'd walked across the parking lot, a man who had decided and was simply moving in the direction of the decision. At the edge of the living room he stopped, his back still to her. Christiana. She stilled. He said you had nothing without him. A pause, not for effect, for precision. He was wrong. He kept walking. She sat at the counter of a stranger's kitchen in Seoul at 2 a.m. with 4001, and a torn jacket, and the complicated, fragile, terrifying sensation of a person who has just been told the truth about themselves by someone with no reason to lie. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city burned gold. Somewhere in it, David was already planning his next move. And somewhere behind a door at the end of a hallway, Ye Changmin was becoming something she did not yet have a word for. But his phone had never stopped lighting up, and the men who moved like shadows had not gone home. And the silence in this apartment, for all its gentleness, was the silence of a man standing at the center of something enormous, holding very still so she wouldn't feel the size of it yet. She would. Soon enough she would. The room had a closet with sliding doors, and she opened them first thing in the morning because she needed to know the dimensions of what she had. Empty, clean cedar shelving, evenly spaced, built for a wardrobe that hadn't arrived yet. She stood in front of it for a moment and felt the particular hollowness of a space designed for things that weren't there, and recognized, somewhere below conscious thought, that she'd been living inside that metaphor for 2 years. She closed the doors and got dressed in yesterday's clothes. The apartment was quiet in the morning with a different quality than it had been at 2 a.m., less atmospheric pressure, more ordinary. Sunlight came through the floor-to-ceiling windows at an angle that hit the wooden floors and stayed there, uncomplicated. Seoul moved 20 floors below in its morning configuration, delivery scooters and commuters, and the particular organized urgency of a city that did not slow down for anyone's personal reckoning. Changmin was already at the kitchen counter with coffee and a document he was reading with the focused stillness of a man who had been awake for some time before she arrived. He looked up when she appeared, looked back at the document, set a second cup on the counter's edge without comment. She sat and wrapped both hands around it and accepted that as the morning's greeting because it was. She was learning how he operated, presence communicated through action rather than announcement. She drank the coffee and watched the city below and said nothing. He said nothing. It was, startlingly enough. Woojin arrived at 9. She knew his name now because Changmin had said it once, directing him toward her door, and Woojin had absorbed the instruction with the particular economy of someone who had stopped requiring context a long time ago. He was younger than she'd assessed in the dark of the parking lot, late 20s, maybe, with a face that would have been approachable under different professional circumstances. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and waited. Changmin looked at her. Tell him what to get. She thought about the apartment on the 4th floor of a building in Mapogu that had her name on none of the paperwork. She thought about what David would have done last night after the parking lot, not the emotional processing. He would defer that, weaponize it later, but the immediate practical response. Moved things, hidden things, calculated which of her possessions constituted leverage. My passport, she said. It's in the lining of a gray tote bag in the bedroom closet, not on the shelf. He doesn't know that compartment exists. 2 hard drives, both in a shoebox on the top shelf behind winter coats. My academic notebooks, brown covers stacked on the desk, and a green jacket. Woojin absorbed this without writing any of it down, just looked at her steadily. The jacket isn't practical, she added. It was my grandmother's. Woojin looked at Changmin once. Changmin moved his chin a fraction. Woojin left. The door closed. Christiana looked down at her coffee. The thing about nomming the objects was that nomming them made the life they represented real again. The hard drives with 3 years of research notes, the notebooks filled with annotations in 2 languages, the passport that meant she was still, legally, a person who existed in the world on her own terms. David had a copy of her passport. She already knew that. She set the cup down and looked at Changmin. He'll know, she said. When they come, he'll know I have someone behind me and he'll recalibrate. Yes. That makes him more dangerous, not less. Changmin looked at her with the expression she was starting to catalog. Not agreement exactly, but a recognition that she was reading the situation accurately, and he saw no reason to soften it. Also yes, he said. She nodded. There was something clarifying about a man who didn't protect her from true things. And here is what nobody tells you about leaving an abuser. The leaving is not the end of it. It's the beginning of a different chapter of it. Because a man like David doesn't experience your departure as your freedom. He experiences it as an attack, and attacks require retaliation. The parking lot was Christiana getting out. What came next was David getting even. Stay with me. Her phone buzzed at 11:17. She was sitting on the floor of the guest room with the door open, her back against the bed frame, making a list on the notepad she'd found in the nightstand. Visa renewal process, university re-enrollment contacts, legal aid organizations for foreign nationals in Seoul. The phone was face up beside her knee, and she saw his name on the screen and felt her nervous system respond before her mind caught up, the way a burned hand moves from heat before the brain has filed the report. She let it ring. 7 times, then voicemail. 40 seconds of silence, and then the buzz of a text. I hope you slept somewhere safe. I've been worried. She read it once, recognized the construction of it, the I've been worried doing the work of casting him as concerned rather than surveilling, the somewhere safe implying the alternative was her recklessness rather than his. 2 years of this grammar. She knew every tense of it. She put the phone face down and returned to her list. At 11:54, another text. You left some important documents here. Your health insurance card and the lease renewal form that was due this week. I can drop them wherever you are. The lease renewal form that didn't exist because her name was not on the lease. The health insurance card that was registered to his address. She recognized the architecture, both items invented or exaggerated to require her response, to require a location, to require a crack in the door she had closed. She put the phone face down again. At 12:30, Woojin returned. He set her gray tote on the bed, the 2 hard drives in their shoebox, the stack of brown notebooks, all 7 of them, which meant he had counted them and taken all of them, and she felt something loosen in her chest at that, and folded neatly on top, the green jacket. She picked it up. The fabric was worn at the left cuff the way it had always been, soft from decades of a different woman's wrist living inside it. She pressed it once between her palms and set it carefully aside. Woojin placed a small envelope on the bed beside the tote. She looked at it. He left it at the door before we arrived, Woojin said. First complete sentence she'd heard from him. He didn't see our faces. She looked at the envelope with her name on it in David's particular precise handwriting. The handwriting of a man who had never been careless about anything in his life, including the construction of traps. She didn't touch it. Is Changmin? Living room, Woojin said and left. She brought the envelope unopened to the living room and set it on the low table without sitting down. Changmin looked at it, then at her. He left it before your men arrived, she said. Which means he went there last night or very early this morning. Which means he already knew where I'd send someone. Which means he went there to leave evidence of his reasonableness before witnesses could establish he'd been served notice. Changmin picked up the envelope, examined the seal, set it back down. He's a lawyer, she said. He's been building a case since the parking lot. Not against you, against me, that I'm unstable, that I made a false accusation, that whatever happens next is my escalation. She paused. He's going to try to use my visa situation and my enrollment gap as evidence of dependency. Make it look like I'm manufacturing a crisis for legal status. Changmin looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had not yet found a word for, not impressed, something quieter and more useful than impressed, like a man recalibrating the weight he'd assigned to something. You've been thinking about this since last night, he said. I've been thinking about this for 8 months, she said. I just didn't have anywhere to put the conclusions. Something shifted in the room, not dramatic. The way a room shifts when a window opens and the air moves, everything the same, the quality of the atmosphere slightly changed. Changmin opened the envelope. Inside was a single note card. She didn't have to read it because she could see it from where she stood and because she knew the language. I forgive you. Come home when you're ready. The door is open. She looked at it for a moment. That's for the record, she said. Not for me. If this goes legal, that card establishes him as the patient, forgiving party and me as the one who left without cause. Changmin set the card down. He looked at the card for a moment longer than necessary, and she wondered what a man who operated in the particular world he operated in made of this specific kind of warfare. The documented kind, the institutional kind, the kind that used paperwork and perception as its primary weapons. Because here's the thing about David that makes him genuinely terrifying. He's not a man who loses his temper and makes a mistake you can point to. He's a man who constructs a reality and invites everyone around him to live inside it. And Christiana had been the primary resident of that reality for 2 years. What she didn't know yet, what neither of them knew, was that David had already made his first phone call. Not to her, not to a lawyer. To someone inside Changmin's world who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. Not David's name this time. An unknown number, Korean area code, 3 words in the message. He knows where. She looked at the screen for 3 full seconds, the message sitting there with its unspecific menace, its deliberate incompleteness, the particular cruelty of information delivered without enough context to act on, but with enough weight to lodge itself in the chest and stay there. She turned the phone and held it out to Changmin. He read it. His expression didn't change in any way she could measure, but something in the room changed. The same atmospheric shift as before, except this time the window that opened let in cold air. He looked up from the screen. Their eyes met, and she saw it, not fear, nothing as uncomplicated as fear. The recalibration of a man who had just received a piece of information that rearranged the geometry of a situation he thought he had already mapped. "Did you tell anyone where you were going last night?" he asked. "Anyone who might have told someone else?" "I didn't know where I was going last night," she said. He looked at the phone again. Set it on the table next to David's note card, the 2 objects sitting beside each other like a before and after, like evidence of the 2 separate wars being run simultaneously, one through the system and one beneath it. She watched him look at both of them and felt the specific cold of understanding arrive at the same moment she saw it arrive in him. David hadn't just recalibrated. David had made a call. And somewhere in the structure of the world, Changmin moved through. A world with its own loyalties and fractures, and men who had been waiting for a reason. Someone had answered. The empty closet in the guest room held her grandmother's jacket now. Everything else that was coming, she had no space built for yet. The groceries arrived without explanation. Woojin set 3 bags on the kitchen counter at 4 in the afternoon and left before Christiana could ask who had ordered them or how anyone had known what to order. She approached the bags with the cautious curiosity of someone who had learned that gifts had fine print and looked inside. Jiffy cornbread mix, a can of black-eyed peas, smoked turkey neck, which meant someone had gone to the international market on the other side of the city because regular supermarkets didn't carry it, collard greens, bundled and fresh, a box of the specific brand of mac and cheese that came in the blue box, not the Korean approximation, hot sauce with a rooster on the label. She stood at the counter and looked at the contents for a long moment. Then she looked toward the hallway where Changmin had been on a call for the past 2 hours, his voice occasional and low, a sound without decipherable edges, the audio equivalent of weather happening in another room. She started cooking. Not because she owed it, not as transaction or performance or the particular domestic appeasement she had spent 2 years cooking inside of, those meals made under the specific pressure of a man whose mood determined whether food was received as care or as an insufficient gesture. She cooked because the smell of greens in a pot was the smell of her grandmother's kitchen on Paulina Street, and she needed something in this apartment to belong to her own history before she lost the thread of it entirely. The cornbread went into the oven at the temperature her grandmother had never written down, but that Christiana carried in her hands like muscle memory. The greens went into the pot with the smoked turkey, and she turned the heat to low and let it do its slow work and stood at the stove and felt, for the first time in recent memory, like a person with a body of knowledge that was entirely her own. Changmin appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped. Whatever he'd been carrying out of that phone call, and she could see it had weight, could see it in the particular set of his jaw, the quality of his stillness that was different from his baseline stillness. It paused when the smell reached him. His expression shifted by a degree so small she almost missed it. "What is that?" he said, not skeptical, something closer to careful. "Dinner," she said. "You can eat it or not, either is fine." He looked at the pot, at the cornbread pan, at the arrangement of the kitchen that she had reorganized slightly without thinking, because reorganizing a kitchen was how she took up space in it, and taking up space was something she was apparently still relearning how to do without apology. He sat at the counter. She cooked. Here is something about Christiana Green that David had worked very hard to make her forget. She was extraordinary before she met him. Honors program at 19. 2 academic publications before her 22nd birthday. The kind of mind that moved through problems the way water moves through complex terrain, finding paths other people hadn't mapped yet. He hadn't fallen in love with her potential. He had recognized it and spent 2 years making sure it stayed under his name. What happens when a woman starts remembering who she was? Stay with me. They ate at the low table by the windows with soul-burning gold below them, and the specific smell of the South Side filling a penthouse apartment in a way that felt improbable and exactly right simultaneously. Changmin ate with the focused attention he gave everything, not complimentary theater, just genuine engagement with what was in front of him. He finished half of what she'd served before either of them spoke. "My mother made something like this," he said. She looked up. He was looking at the greens with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, not the contained unreadability of his default register, but something older and less managed. The face underneath the face. "She was from Busan originally," he continued, "but she lived in Los Angeles for 6 years before I was born. She learned to cook from her neighbor, a woman from Georgia. After she came back to Korea, she kept making it, modified because she couldn't always find the right ingredients, but the principle of it." A pause. "I haven't smelled that since I was 8 years old." Christiana set down her fork. "How old were you when she died?" 11. The number sat between them with the particular weight that early losses carry, not fresh grief, something denser and more integrated, a fact that has been lived with long enough to become structural. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it without ceremony. He looked at her, nodded once. The acknowledgement of a man who had received condolences so many times over so many years that he could distinguish the genuine ones from the reflexive ones, and had chosen to receive this one. "Chicago," he said, which was both a subject change and a continuation of the same conversation. "South Side," she said. "Inglewood, technically, though I always said Chicago because people make assumptions about Inglewood before you finish the sentence." "What kind of assumptions?" "The kind that have nothing to do with my grandmother's garden, or the way the whole block came out for 4th of July, or my high school debate coach, who wrote my first recommendation letter." She picked up her fork again. "The kind that flatten a place into its worst headlines and leave out everything that made the people in it remarkable." Changmin looked at her steadily. "You were going to study here," he said, not a question. He'd assembled it from available information, the way he seemed to assemble most things. "Korean literature and translation theory," she said. "My thesis was on untranslatable concepts, words that exist in one language that have no equivalent in another. The gap between languages as a cultural document." "Nunchai," he said. She looked at him. "The awareness of a room's atmosphere," he said. "Reading unspoken dynamics, there is no English word for it." "That's exactly it," she said, and felt the particular electricity of being understood in the specific register you actually operate in, not the simplified version, the real one. "I had 47 examples mapped before I stopped going to class." The before and after of that sentence occupied the space between them. "He made you stop," Changmin said. "He made me feel like continuing was a choice I was making against him," she said, which is a more precise description of how it worked. There was never a direct order, just a sustained atmosphere in which my ambitions became evidence of my selfishness, and my absences became proof that I didn't value what we had. She looked at the city below. By the time I understood the mechanism, I was already inside the result. Changmin was quiet for a moment. "Nunchai," he said again quietly. "You had it. He used it against you." She turned that over. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what he did." And this is the thing about two people finding each other in the specific wreckage of their separate histories. The connection doesn't arrive like a flood. It arrives like a frequency. A signal you've always been capable of receiving, meeting a signal you didn't know was being sent. Christiana didn't fall for Changmin in that kitchen, but she recognized something. And recognition, in the right conditions, is where everything begins. She cleared the plates because the act of it was familiar and grounding, and because she was thinking about what to say next, and movement helped her think. Changmin remained at the table with his coffee and the particular quality of waiting that wasn't impatience, just presence held in reserve. "Your mother," she said from the kitchen, What was the deathbed wish? The silence that followed had a different texture from his usual silences. She turned from the sink. He was looking at the window, at the gold of the city or at the reflection of the room in the glass. She couldn't tell which. His coffee cup was in both hands the way her grandmother held a cup when she was about to say something she'd been carrying a long time. She made me promise, he said slowly, that I would find a life that was mine, not my father's, not the family's. A pause. She had watched my father build something that consumed him entirely, and she didn't want that for me. She said I was 11. I remember every word, she said. Changmina, the most dangerous thing a man can inherit is a purpose he didn't choose. Christiana leaned against the kitchen counter and said nothing, because this was a sentence that needed space around it. I was inside his world before I was old enough to know there were others, he continued. By the time I understood what she meant, I was already necessary to it. There were people whose safety depended on my position, structures that would collapse in specific ways if I stepped back carelessly. He looked at his coffee. Leaving isn't simple when leaving has consequences for people who didn't choose to be in your position either. So you stayed, she said. I stay, he said, present tense, deliberate. And I have been building, for the past 3 years, a version of things that my cousin Jay can carry when it's time, so that I can step back without the collapse. He looked at her finally. My mother asked me to find a life that was mine. I am attempting to make the conditions for that possible. Christiana looked at him across the kitchen, and the table, and the distance between two people who had arrived at the same conversation from entirely opposite directions. She sounds like she was extraordinary, she said. She was from Busan, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. They all are. She laughed. It came out before she'd approved it, small and real, and it surprised them both, or rather it surprised her and registered on him as something he filed carefully, the way you file something you weren't expecting to find valuable. The apartment held the warmth of cooked food and the particular ease of two people who had, without designing it, spent an evening inside each other's histories. Then her phone lit up on the counter. Not a call, a notification. An email, and the sender's name in the preview stopped her breath with the efficiency of a hand closing around a throat. The university. Subject line, regarding your enrollment status and academic visa compliance. She crossed the kitchen and picked it up and read the first 2 sentences, and felt the warmth of the evening reorganize itself into something colder and more familiar. David had moved faster than she'd calculated, not through her phone this time, not through notes left at doors, through the institution, through her academic record, through the formal channels he had spent 5 years in this country learning to navigate with the precision of a man who understood that the most effective cage has official letterhead. She looked up. Changmin read her face the way he read rooms. What? He said. She turned the phone and held it out. He read it, set the phone down, looked at the table for a moment with the expression of a man doing rapid structural calculation, not panic, the opposite of panic, the cold-focused assessment of someone adding a new variable to an existing equation and solving for its implications. Then he looked at her with something in his eyes that she hadn't seen there yet. Not just assessment, not just the contained authority of a man in his own apartment managing a situation. Something that had an edge of personal in it. Something that looked, in the particular gold light of soul coming through the windows, like the moment a man decides something he won't be talked out of. His phone lit up at the same moment. He looked at the screen, and something in his face went very still in the way it had gone still in the parking lot, the stillness that reorganized into something with edges. He answered. 2 words of Korean, quiet and absolute. Then he looked at her, and she understood, with the nunchai she'd been told had no English translation, that whatever David had just activated by going through the university, whatever contact he had reached, whatever door inside Changmin's world he had managed to locate and knock on, it had just knocked back. And the sound it made did not resemble anything as simple as a lawyer protecting his leverage. The meeting wasn't announced. That was the first indication it wasn't a meeting. It was a summons. Changmin was at his desk at 7 in the morning when the message came through on the secondary phone, the one that lived in the top drawer and whose screen she had never seen lit until now. He read it without changing expression, set it face down, picked up his coffee, and in the particular grammar of his silences, which she was becoming fluent in the way you become fluent in a language you're immersed in without choosing to be, she understood that the message had weight he was not going to share immediately. She didn't ask. She took her coffee to the window and gave him the space to carry it until he decided otherwise, because that was the exchange they had arrived at without negotiating it. She didn't perform unawareness of his world, and he didn't perform unawareness of hers, and in the gap between those two courtesies, something functional and honest had begun to grow. At 7:45 he stood, put on his coat and looked at her. "I'll be back before afternoon," he said. "Okay," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd catalogued as his version of deliberation, not hesitation, something more intentional than that. A man deciding how much of a true thing to hand over. "Don't answer the door," he said. "Woojin is outside." He left. She stood at the window with her coffee and watched the city conduct its morning, and understood that whatever had been set in motion by David's phone call 3 days ago had just arrived at the next stage of itself. The building was in Gangnam, and it had no sign. Changmin had been inside it 41 times in his life, and he remembered every occasion with the precision of a man who understood that certain rooms required accounting. The elevator required a key that had been his father's and was now his. The floor it opened onto had no windows. The table in the center was long and dark, and the 8 men seated around it had been seated around it, in various configurations, for longer than Changmin had been alive. His uncle sat at the head. Sung Riho was 63 years old, and had the particular physical authority of a man who had never once in his adult life been required to raise his voice. He was compact, precise, dressed in the charcoal gray that was his daily uniform, and he looked at Changmin the way he looked at everything, with the patient assessment of someone who had already completed the calculation and was waiting for the variables to catch up. Changmin sat. The room's silence had its own protocol. He waited inside it. 3 days, his uncle said, not an accusation, a document being entered into record. Yes, Changmin said. An American woman, a stranger from a parking lot. Sung Riho's tone carried no editorial weight. That was its own kind of editorial weight. In your home for 3 days. Yes. The man to Sung Riho's left, Beek Dasun, whose primary function on the council was translating sentiment into pressure, set both hands flat on the table. The parking lot incident has been described to 3 separate parties who did not need the information. Whatever you intended as a private gesture has become a public position. I'm aware, Changmin said. Then you're aware, Dasun continued, that a foreign woman with no legal standing, an active visa complication, and a connection to an American lawyer who has already made contact with 2 members of this council is not a private gesture. She is a liability dressed as one. The room absorbed this. Changmin looked at his uncle. Because here is what Christiana didn't know was happening while she sat at the window with her coffee. The world Changmin occupied had rules older than either of them, and those rules had never been designed with her existence in mind. The council didn't hate her. Hatred would have been simpler. They saw her the way a structural engineer sees a crack in a load-bearing wall, not personal, not emotional, just a problem that needed correction before it became collapse. What she also didn't know was that David had found the crack first and was already inside it. The lawyer, Changmin said. Tell me exactly what contact he made and with whom. Sung Riho's eyes moved to the man at the far end of the table, Cho Min-tak, whose presence at council meetings was always significant because Min-tak only attended when the information being discussed was information he had sourced. Min-tak was 55 and had the face of a man who had spent 30 years being underestimated, which was precisely why he was effective. He reached Prosecutor Wu's office through a colleague at the Seoul Bar Association, Min-tak said. The contact was framed as a welfare inquiry regarding an American national. The subtext was sufficient. Prosecutor Wu's office has been looking for a credible entry point for 14 months. The room's silence became a different kind of silence. Changmin set his coffee down. Prosecutor Wu, 14 months of a file being built without a viable access point. And David, A man with 5 years of professional relationships in Seoul, and the specific social fluency of someone who had learned exactly which doors responded to which kinds of knocking, had handed Wu's office a credible entry point within 72 hours of a parking lot. Not improvised, prepared. The kind of preparation that meant David had maintained a contingency for exactly this type of situation and had been waiting for the conditions to deploy it. Christiana had been the condition. He knew, Changmin said, not to the room, processing aloud. He knew you by name before the parking lot, Mintak confirmed. The lawyer has been in Seoul 5 years. He researches his environments. He knew who was in that parking lot before she ran to you, whether he anticipated the specific outcome. He didn't anticipate the specific outcome, Changmin said, but he built a response architecture that could use any outcome. The room received this. Sung Riho had not moved, had not changed expression, had watched Changmin process this information with the patience of a man who had already processed it yesterday and was allowing his nephew the courtesy of arriving at the same place independently. She has to go, Dawson said, flat, final, the tone of a man stating a conclusion the room had reached before the meeting started. Whatever your intention in that parking lot, and I have no interest in interrogating your intentions, the result is a foreign national living in your home who has become a vector for Prosecutor Wu's office. The council's position is unanimous. The council's position, Changmin said carefully, is a recommendation. The room temperature shifted. Dawson looked at Sung Riho. Sung Riho looked at Changmin with the expression of a man who had loved his nephew since the boy was 11 years old, and who understood that love and institutional authority occupied separate jurisdictions and had never confused them. Changmin, he said, the diminutive form, deliberate, personal. I am going to speak to you now as your father's brother and not as the head of this council, so that you understand I am not making a political argument. Changmin waited. Your father spent 20 years believing that the right person would change the nature of this life. That love was sufficient architecture for a different kind of existence. A pause. Your mother died at 41. I watched my brother bury her and understand too late what his world had cost her. I watched you stand at that grave at 11 years old. Sung Riho's voice didn't change in volume or tempo. It didn't need to. I am not asking you to be cruel to the woman. I am asking you to understand that the road your father walked ends in a specific place, and you are 3 days down it. The room was very quiet. Changmin looked at his uncle for a long moment. What did David offer Prosecutor Wu's office specifically? He said. Mintak answered. Testimony and documentation regarding 3 transactions from 18 months ago. A witness account that could be corroborated through the American national's presence in your home as evidence of an ongoing relationship that predates, and therefore contextualizes, those transactions. It's fabricated, Changmin said. Fabrication is Wu's problem to disprove, Mintak said. The damage is in the filing, not the outcome. 18 months of discovery proceedings regardless of verdict. Dawson set his hands flat on the table again. Remove the witness, remove the entry point. David loses his access and Wu's office loses its credibility. This ends before it begins. And this is the part where I need you to understand something about Ye Changmin that the council understood and was using. He had never once in his adult life made a decision that prioritized himself over the structure he was responsible for. Not once. Every calculation he had ever made had the family's survival as its first variable. They knew that. David had known that too, which was why this was constructed the way it was. They were all betting on the same thing. That Changmin's sense of responsibility was the lever that moved him. What none of them had fully calculated was what 3 days of collard greens and untranslatable words, and a woman who looked at him like he was a person rather than a position had done to the weighting of that lever. Changmin drove back alone. Woojin had offered, and he declined with a look, because there were certain kinds of thinking that required the specific solitude of a car in city traffic, where the external movement gave the internal movement somewhere to go. His mother's voice, 22 years compressed into a single sentence. The most dangerous thing a man can inherit is a purpose he didn't choose. He had told Christiana that last night at the table, with the smell of her grandmother's kitchen filling his apartment, and he had watched something in her face, recognized something in those words, and he had felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a man in a conversation rather than a man in a position. The council was not wrong about the risk. That was the precise and terrible fact of it. They were not wrong. David had constructed something genuinely dangerous, and Christiana's presence in his home was the pin that held it together. Removing her removed the architecture. Simple, clean, achievable. His uncle was not wrong about his father's road. That was the other fact, also precise, also terrible. He pulled into the underground garage and sat in the car for a moment after the engine stopped. Then he went upstairs. She was at the kitchen counter with her brown notebooks open and 3 browser tabs on the laptop Woojin had brought her yesterday, university re-enrollment procedures. He could see from the doorway, and legal aid contacts, and a translation theory journal she'd pulled up and was reading with the focused attention of a woman reclaiming a self that had been in storage. She looked up. Read his face with the nunchai he'd named for her 2 nights ago. "How bad?" she said. He set his keys on the counter, looked at her notebooks, at the green jacket hung over the back of the stool, at the woman who had come to this country to study the gaps between languages and had ended up living in the gap between 2 worlds that had no word for what she was inside them. "The council wants you gone," he said, because she had asked for true things from the beginning and he was not going to start softening them now. She absorbed this without flinching, nodded once, slowly, the nod of a woman who had been expecting the shape of this news and was simply receiving its specific dimensions. "And what do you want?" she said. The question landed in the room and stayed there. Changmin looked at her across the kitchen, this woman with her grandmother's jacket and her 47 untranslatable words and her list of legal aid contacts and her refusal to look away from hard things, and understood that his uncle and David and every man in that windowless room had made the same error. They had calculated for the structure of his responsibilities. None of them had calculated for her. "I want you to stay," he said. The apartment was very quiet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul conducted its afternoon with complete indifference to the fact that Ye Changmin had just made the first decision in his adult life that had himself as its first variable. Christiana looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at her notebook, uncapped her pen, and wrote something down deliberate and unhurried, like a woman adding a fact to a record she intended to keep. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. But her phone lit up on the counter between them, and the name on the screen wasn't David's. It was Jay's. And the single line of his message sat there in the afternoon light like a door, swinging open onto a room neither of them had been shown yet. "Uncle Reho knows I've been talking to her. We need to meet. Tonight, don't bring Woojin." The invitation came through Jay. That was the first thing wrong with it. Jay had met them 2 nights ago in a pajang matcha in Mapogu, a canvas-walled street stall that smelled of fish, cake, broth, and soju. The kind of place where nobody looked twice at anyone because everyone was focused on their own conversation. He was 24 and had his uncle's eyes and his own particular energy, the specific tension of a young man carrying inherited weight he hadn't chosen and hadn't yet found the language to refuse. He'd sat across from Christiana with the careful assessment of someone who'd heard a great deal about a person before meeting them, and she'd watched him decide, over the course of 40 minutes and 2 rounds of ramyeon, that what he'd heard and what was sitting in front of him were different documents. He'd looked at Changmin at the end of the evening. "She should meet Jai Woo," he'd said, carefully, "before Jai Woo manufactures the meeting herself." Changmin had looked at his cousin for a long moment. "Why?" he'd said, not a question, an invitation to complete the argument. "Because Jai Woo is on the council's side, and the council knows it," Jay had said. "And a meeting Jai Woo controls is a meeting the council sees. A meeting we arrange is information we hold." Christiana had looked at Changmin. He had looked at the table. "When?" he'd said. So the invitation came through Jay, and that was the first thing wrong with it. And the second thing wrong with it was the venue. A private dining room in a restaurant in Cheongdam that belonged, Woojin informed her while driving, to a family whose relationship with the council was long-standing, and whose staff understood the architecture of discretion. Meaning whatever happened inside it stayed inside it. Meaning the room had been chosen by someone who understood that certain conversations required the specific privacy of a place, with no witnesses outside the table. Meaning Jai Wu had agreed to Jay's arrangement and then immediately made it her own. Christiana dressed carefully. Not for Jai Wu, for herself. There was a distinction and she held it deliberately, because 2 years of dressing for David's approval had taught her the corrosive difference between clothing as armor you choose and clothing as costume you perform. She wore the one dress she owned that she had bought entirely alone, before Soul, before him, deep burgundy, structured at the shoulder, the kind of garment that had never required a second opinion. She put on the small gold earrings that had been her mother's. She looked at herself in the mirrored closet doors and saw a woman who had survived a parking lot and a council summons and a university threat, and was still standing in her grandmother's earrings. That was enough. Changmin was waiting in the living room. He looked at her the way he looked at things he found significant, but hadn't decided to name yet. "Ready," she said. "Yes," he said, looking at her, not himself. "We are." Here is what Christiana knew about Jai Wu before walking into that room. She was 31, the daughter of one of the council's founding families, and she had been engaged to Changmin for 14 months 4 years ago before the engagement ended in a way nobody discussed openly. She was a woman who had grown up inside the world Christiana had stumbled into from a parking lot. She knew its grammar, its protocols, its specific social violence, whatever she was going to do tonight. She had been doing versions of it her entire life. Christiana had 48 hours of preparation and one burgundy dress. Remember that. Jai Wu was already seated when they arrived. This was also her arrangement, to be present first, to own the room's initial atmosphere, to greet rather than be greeted. She was beautiful in the particular way of women who have always known they were beautiful and have built a specific kind of competence around it, using it the way any tool is used, efficiently and without sentiment. Her dress was ivory, and her posture was absolute, and she looked at Christiana's entrance with an expression of such composed pleasantness that the pleasantness itself became the weapon. "Changmin," she said first, his name in her mouth with the ease of long ownership. Then she looked at Christiana with the same composed smile. "And you must be the American." Not her name, the American, the article doing the work of a category rather than a person. Christiana smiled. "Christiana Green," she said. "And you must be Jai Wu," returning the construction with the same light tone, refusing to receive the diminishment while declining to announce she'd noticed it. "Jay speaks highly of you." Something moved in Jai Wu's eyes. A recalibration, brief and quickly managed. They sat. Jay arrived 3 minutes later with the specific energy of a man who had organized an event and was already uncertain about it. He kissed Jai Wu's cheek with the affection of a cousin, and looked at Christiana with the look of an ally checking a fellow soldier's ammunition before engagement. She gave him the smallest nod. They ordered. The food was extraordinary in the precise, restrained way of restaurants that didn't need to announce themselves. The conversation moved through the expected registers: the city, a gallery opening, a piece of legislation affecting real estate development in Yongsan. Jai Wu conducted it with the fluency of a woman who had been trained since childhood to manage rooms through conversation, keeping the surface smooth and the undercurrent entirely deliberate. Christiana participated without performing, asked genuine questions, listened with the attention she'd always given things she found interesting, and waited. Because here is the thing about a woman like Jai Wu, she doesn't attack directly. Direct attack is for people who haven't learned the more elegant methods. She builds a context. She creates a frame. And then she says something that sounds, to anyone listening without full information, like a reasonable observation. What it actually is a mirror aimed to reflect the most unflattering version of you back at yourself in front of people whose opinion you need. Christiana had 2 years of advanced training in exactly this method. She recognized the setup 30 seconds before it arrived. It arrived over the second course. Jai Wu set down her chopsticks with the deliberateness of a woman shifting registers, and looked at Christiana with an expression of such genuine-seeming warmth that the warmth itself was the tell. "I have to say," she said, I think what you did was incredibly brave. The table's attention organized itself toward Christiana. Running to a stranger in a parking lot, Jai-woo continued. Most women would have, found another way, called an embassy, perhaps, a shelter, the kinds of resources that exist for situations like yours. A small tilt of the head. But you made a different choice, very instinctive, the pause was surgical, immediate. Instinctive, immediate, words that meant impulsive, words that meant desperate, words that, in this room, meant she grabbed the first available man without consideration of consequence. Jay looked at his water glass. Changmin looked at Jai-woo with an expression that was very still. Christiana looked at Jai-woo and felt the shape of the thing clearly, the frame being built in real time, the image being installed, the version of her that Jai-woo was constructing for this table, and through this table for the council. A woman without resources, without judgment, without standing. Someone who had arrived in Changmin's life the way an accident arrives, through no design on either side, leaving damage regardless. She took a breath. The embassy was an option, Christiana said, conversational, considering it genuinely as though Jai-woo had raised a reasonable point worth examining. A shelter, too, though shelters for English-speaking foreign nationals in Seoul have an average intake wait of 3 to 5 days, during which your visa status is flagged for review by the host institution. The embassy option involves a formal report that becomes a matter of public record, which his lawyer, which is what he is, a lawyer with 5 years of professional relationships in this city, could access and use as the first document in a case establishing my instability. She picked up her chopsticks. I made the calculation in about 4 seconds. It wasn't instinct. It was applied information. The table was quiet. Jai-woo's smile didn't waver, but her eyes recalibrated again, and this time the recalibration took slightly longer. Of course, Jai-woo said graciously. I only meant that most people wouldn't have had the presence of mind. It's impressive. The compliment, landing over the previous assessment, like a coat over a blade. Thank you, Christiana said, and returned to her food. Jay reached for the communal dish, with slightly more energy than necessary. The second move came 20 minutes later, and it was more precise. Jai-woo had been speaking about Changmin's schedule, the upcoming obligations, a dinner with a business contact in Busan, the particular demands of his position, with the proprietary familiarity of a woman establishing her knowledge of his life as superior to anyone else's at the table. Christiana had listened without expression. Then Jai-woo looked at her with the expression of someone sharing useful information. I suppose it's all very new for you, she said. His world, the complexity of it. A small pause. It's a great deal to absorb, even for someone prepared for it, for someone who grew up understanding what this life requires. The implication completing itself in the space after the sentence. It asks specific things of the people in it, specific sacrifices, specific kinds of understanding that take years to develop. You don't belong here, built from 6 sentences, none of which said it. You can't sustain this, delivered as concern. He deserves better than a woman who stumbled in from a parking lot, never stated, perfectly communicated. Christiana set her chopsticks down. She looked at Jai-woo with the clarity of a woman who had spent 2 years having her reality constructed for her by someone else, and had made a specific decision about never allowing that again. You're right that it asks specific things, she said. I've been thinking about that. She looked at the table briefly, then back at Jai-woo. I think the specific thing it asks more than preparation or familiarity is the willingness to see a person clearly, not the position, the person. A pause. That's not something you grow up knowing, it's something you decide. The table held the sentence. Jai-woo looked at her for a moment, with the first entirely unmanaged expression of the evening. Then she looked at Changmin. And Changmin, who had been still through the entire dinner with the quality of stillness that was not passivity, but restraint, a man holding his response until it was necessary, looked back at Jai-woo with an expression that answered the question she hadn't asked aloud. Jai-woo's composure returned, complete, immediate, impressive, actually, in the way that absolute self-discipline is always impressive regardless of how it's deployed. Well, she said lightly, the food here is exceptional. The car was quiet on the way home. Jay had stayed behind. Christiana had seen him touch Jai Woo's arm as they left, something passing between them that she filed without opening yet. The city moved past the window in its nighttime configuration. Changmin sat beside her and said nothing for 4 minutes. Then, you didn't need me to intervene. No, she said. I know, something in his voice that she turned to read. I'm saying I saw that. I want you to know I saw it. She looked at him in the dark of the car. He was looking forward, but his hand resting on the seat between them was open, not reaching, not performing, just open, present, available. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed hers in it. Neither of them spoke again until the car reached the underground garage. But when they stepped out, Woojin was standing at the elevator with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not the neutral competence of his daily register, but something stripped of management. He looked at Changmin. The council met tonight, he said, while you were at dinner. Changmin went still. Mintak voted with your uncle, Woojin said, all 8 members. A pause that had the weight of a structural wall developing a crack. They've given Jay the choice. Step back from her. A look at Christiana, brief and not unkind, or step back from the succession. The elevator doors opened. Christiana understood, in the particular silence that followed, that Jai Woo had not come to that dinner to shame her. She had come to confirm something for the council. And the hand Christiana had placed in Changmin's, that quiet, unglamorous moment in the back of a dark car, had been, somehow, the thing they'd been sent to witness. They left at 3 a.m. Not because 3 a.m. was the plan. There was no plan at 3 a.m. There was Changmin's secondary phone lighting up twice in 40 minutes with messages that made him stand from the kitchen table and move through the apartment with a quality of purpose that was different from his usual purpose. More compressed. The way weather compresses before it breaks. Christiana was already awake. She'd been awake since the elevator, since Woojin's face, since the specific understanding that Jai Woo's dinner had not been social warfare but reconnaissance. A confirmation delivered to the council in real time that Changmin had chosen, and that the choosing had the permanence of a man who had located his first variable. She was sitting on the bed with her brown notebooks stacked beside her, and her grandmother's jacket across her lap when Changmin appeared in the doorway. He looked at the notebooks, at the jacket, at her face. How long do I have? She said. 10 minutes, he said. Take what matters. She was ready in 7. The car that came was not the black sedan. It was older, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that moved through Seoul without accumulating attention. The driver was a man she hadn't seen before, late 50s, unhurried, with the hands of someone who had driven roads in the dark more times than he'd driven them in daylight. He didn't speak. Changmin sat in the front. Christiana sat in the back with her bag between her feet and watched Seoul unspool through the window as they moved through its outer districts, and then beyond them, the city's density thinning into the particular dark of roads that existed between places rather than within them. She watched Changmin's profile in the front seat. He was on the phone. Quiet, clipped exchanges she caught fragments of not enough Korean yet to assemble the whole, enough to read the register. Controlled urgency. The tone of a man issuing instructions he'd hoped not to need while making sure they were followed precisely. After the 3rd call, he put the phone in his pocket and looked out the windshield at the dark road ahead. She waited. Mintak, he said, without turning. He's been feeding information to the council's opposition within the family for 8 months, not to protect the structure, to position himself for what comes after it. She absorbed this. David gave him the opening, she said. David gave him the timing, Changmin said. The opening had been prepared much longer than that. The car moved through mountain dark, the headlights finding the road in intervals. Here is what a coup inside a criminal organization looks like from the outside. It looks like nothing. No visible fracture, no announcement, no moment you can point to and say, there, that was when it changed. It looks like meetings that run slightly longer, votes that land differently than they should, men who have been loyal for a decade suddenly unavailable when you call. It feels like weather changing in a room with no windows. You know something has shifted. You cannot locate the specific mechanism. By the time you can, the shift is already structural. Changmin had been watching the weather for 3 years. What he hadn't calculated was the speed at which David's entry point would accelerate an 8-month preparation into a 72-hour execution. The safe house was 4 hours from Seoul. It sat at the end of a road that stopped being a road approximately 2 kilometers before the structure itself, transitioning into compressed earth and pine needles, and the kind of silence that exists only at significant elevation. The building was low and stone, set into the mountain's contour, the way things built to last are set, not imposing the landscape, but accommodating it. Inside it was spare and functional. A main room with a fireplace, a kitchen stocked with the basics, 2 bedrooms and windows on the eastern wall that would, she understood at dawn, face the mountains directly. Changmin built a fire without speaking. She unpacked the kitchen because movement was her version of what fire building was his, something to do with the hands while the mind worked through architecture. She found rice and dried goods and enough for several days, arranged with a deliberateness that told her this had been prepared recently by someone who knew what recently might mean. "Woojin," Changmin said, reading her expression from across the room. "Is he safe?" she said. "He's not in Seoul tonight," Changmin said, which was its own kind of answer. She boiled water and made tea and brought 2 cups to the main room and sat across from him with the fire between them and the mountain dark outside the windows and the particular quality of a situation that has arrived at its most essential form. Stripped of the city, the apartment, the social architecture, down to 2 people, and the problem they were inside. "Tell me all of it," she said. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he told her. Mintak had spent 8 months building a parallel structure within the family, not a rebellion, something more patient than rebellion. A succession of small repositionings. Men moved to different functions, loyalties tested and catalogued. A quiet accumulation of obligation that, when called in simultaneously, would shift the council's effective power from Changmin's line to Mintak's without requiring a single dramatic gesture. The kind of takeover that happens in ledgers rather than confrontations. Jay had been the complication Mintak hadn't fully solved. Jay's succession, the path Changmin had been building for 3 years to allow his own exit, was the structural piece that Mintak's architecture required. A cooperative Jay meant a clean transfer of legitimacy. An uncooperative Jay meant a contested one. David had solved Mintak's Jay problem. By giving the council grounds to demand Jay choose between Christiana and the succession, David had handed Mintak a pressure point that bypassed 3 years of careful positioning. If Jay stepped back from Christiana, he stepped back from Changmin's protection and into Mintak's alignment. If he refused, his succession was compromised, and Mintak's candidate moved forward without obstruction. "David doesn't know any of this specifically," Changmin said. "He knows how to find a fracture and apply pressure. The fracture was already there, he just accelerated the physics." Christiana looked at the fire. "So I'm not just a liability to the council," she said. "I'm the mechanism Mintak used to force Jay's hand and destabilize your succession plans simultaneously." "Yes. And David gets what he wants in the process. If the succession collapses and my position weakens, I have less capacity to protect you and more immediate concerns than one American lawyer," Changmin said. From his perspective, it's efficient architecture. She was quiet for a moment. "He really is terrifying," she said, not with fear, with the specific exhausted recognition of a woman nomming something she had lived inside and is finally seeing from the outside. "Yes," Changmin said. "So is Mintak." "Yes. And the council has declared the coup." Effectively, the vote Jay was given, step back or lose the succession, that wasn't discipline. That was the opening move. She looked at him across the fire. "What does Jay do?" she said. Something moved in Changmin's expression. "He called me," he said, 20 minutes before we left. He said," a pause, the pause of a man holding something carefully. "He said his father has been Mintak's inside contact for the past 8 months. The fire shifted. She understood what that meant. Not abstractly, she understood it in the specific human weight of it. Jay's father. The treasonous shadow Jay had been caught in, the thing he'd wanted to lead away from with integrity. Not a metaphor. A fact. His own father aligned with a man dismantling his cousin's world. He chose, she said. He chose, Changmin confirmed. And this is where I need you to understand something about what it costs a person to choose correctly, when correctly means against their own blood. Jay had grown up in a family where loyalty to structure was the primary moral language. Choosing Changmin meant choosing against his father. It meant standing in a line of fire that hadn't been aimed at him and refusing to move. He was 24 years old. He made the call in the middle of the night and he didn't hesitate. Remember that when we get to what comes next. Dawn came through the eastern windows, exactly as she'd anticipated. The mountains arrived in increments. First the suggestion of mass in the dark, then the edges, then the full-dimensional reality of them, enormous and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful in the specific way of things that have existed long enough to be beyond opinion. She was sitting at the window with her notebook open when Changmin came out of the kitchen with coffee. He set hers on the sill and stood beside her and looked at the mountains and said nothing for a long time. My mother came here once, he said eventually. Before I was born, she said the mountains in Korea feel inhabited, not by people, by something older. Christiana looked at the range. She was right, she said. He looked at her notebook. She'd been writing since before dawn, not her thesis notes, something else. He didn't ask. She turned it slightly so he could see the page. A list, structured, dated entries at the top. Timeline of David's actions. Contact points with prosecutor Wu's office. Academic record discrepancies introduced through third-party filing. Visa complication triggers and their legal remedies. He looked at it. If this goes to any kind of formal proceeding, she said, David's construction depends on my appearing reactive and unstable. This is the counter-document. Every action he's taken, dated and sourced and attached to its legal remedy. She tapped the page. He built a narrative, I'm building a record. Changmin looked at the notebook, with the expression she'd catalogued, as his version of something that moved him without his full permission. I have a contact, he said. A lawyer, outside the council's relationships. She handles foreign national cases and she is, he chose the word carefully, not accessible to David's network. Set up the meeting, Christiana said. He nodded. His phone buzzed. They both looked at it on the table between the coffee cups. He picked it up, read the message. The stillness that arrived in him was the parking lot stillness, the kind with edges. He turned the phone so she could read it. Jay's number, 2 lines. Father confirmed Mintak's timeline. Vote to remove you from council leadership scheduled for 72 hours from now. They need the succession document. She read it twice. The succession document, she said. The legal instrument that transfers family leadership, Changmin said. Without my signature, it's unenforceable. With it, Mintak has everything, she said. Yes. And without Jay's cooperation, they can't manufacture your signature. Which is why, Changmin said, his voice carrying the specific quiet of a man arriving at the part of the calculation he has been avoiding. Jay is no longer safe in Seoul. She looked at him. He needs to come here, she said. Yes. And Mintak will know that's the logical move. Yes. So the road we came in on is being watched, Changmin said, by morning if it isn't already. The mountains outside, the window held their ancient, inhabited silence. Christiana looked at them for a moment, at the document in her notebook, at the man standing beside her with 72 hours and a succession document, and a cousin who had chosen correctly at 24 years old and was now in the city they'd just fled. She closed the notebook. Then we need a different road, she said. Changmin looked at her. There is one, he said, but it goes back through Seoul. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside, somewhere on the mountain road below them, the dark was full of men who had been patient for 8 months and were no longer required to be. They left the mountain safe house at 4 a.m. Not together. That was the part Christiana had understood was coming since the night before, when Changmin had stood at the safe house window for 40 minutes watching the tree line with the specific quality of stillness that meant he was no longer present in the room even though his body was. She had watched him from the kitchen doorway, and understood, with the nunchai that had become her most reliable instrument, that he had already made the decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to tell her. She had made tea, set a cup beside him without a word. He had picked it up without turning from the window. They had stayed like that for a long time, her in the doorway, him at the glass, the mountain dark and absolute around the small house, the kind of silence that exists between two people who have run out of ways to delay the true thing. Tomorrow, he'd said finally. I know, she'd said. Now it was 4 a.m, and the car Woojin had arranged sat in the narrow gravel drive with its engine running and its headlights off. And Christiana stood in the doorway of the safe house in her grandmother's green jacket and watched Changmin check the inside pocket of his coat with the practiced efficiency of a man completing a familiar inventory. She had promised herself she wouldn't make this harder. She had meant it when she made the promise, and she still meant it now, but meaning something and executing it across the distance of 6 feet, while the man you had chosen was preparing to walk back into a city that wanted him dead, were 2 different cognitive operations. Walk me through it again, she said. Not because she hadn't understood the first time, because hearing it in his voice, structured and deliberate, was the closest thing to control either of them had access to right now. Changmin turned. Woojin takes you to the secondary location in Hanam, he said. The address is in your phone under a contact name you'll recognize. You stay there with 2 of my men until I send the word. You don't use your main number. You don't contact Jay directly. And if the word doesn't come, she said. He looked at her steadily. It will come. Changmin. Woojin has instructions for that contingency, he said. Your visa documentation, your academic reinstatement paperwork, your passport, all of it is in the bag by the door. If the word doesn't come within 48 hours, Woojin puts you on a flight to Chicago. The word Chicago landed in the room with the weight of a door that only opened one way. She looked at the bag by the door that she hadn't packed because she hadn't been able to bring herself to pack it, and Woojin had packed it quietly the previous afternoon without being asked, because Woojin had been doing necessary things without being asked since the beginning, and she had not said anything about the bag, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging the 48-hour contingency, and she had been, in this specific way, a coward. I want to say something, she said. Christiana. Not to talk you out of it, she said quickly. I know what this is. I know why it has to be this way. I'm not going to stand in a doorway at 4 a.m. and be the woman who makes it harder. She stopped, organized. I want to say something true before you go, because I have spent 2 years in a situation where the true things were the first things removed, and I've made a decision about never letting that happen again. He was very still. She held his gaze the way she had relearned to hold gazes, without apology, without the flinch that 2 years of being told she was too much had installed in her nervous system. And I need you to stay with me right here, because this moment, a woman choosing to say the true thing out loud in spite of every reason fear gives you to stay quiet, this is the whole story, not the parking lot, not the council room, not whatever's about to happen in Seoul. This, a woman who had her voice systematically removed, choosing to use it. Drop a comment right now if you know what that costs, if you've ever swallowed the true thing because the room didn't feel safe enough to hold it. You are the first person in 2 years, she said, who has treated my mind like an asset rather than an inconvenience, who has given me space to be competent without requiring me to make myself smaller first. She paused. You handed me back something I didn't know I'd lost until I felt it return. I don't know the right word for what this is between us. I know it started strange, and I know your world is complicated, and I know there are 17 reasons it shouldn't be what it is. But it's what it is, and I needed you to know that I know that before you walk out that door. Changmin looked at her for a long moment. The car engine idled in the gravel drive. The mountain held its darkness around the house. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took her face in both hands with the same deliberate permission that had been his signature from the beginning, asking first, always, in the language of slowness and intention, never arriving without announcement. His hands were warm against her face. She could feel the rings he wore on his right hand, the ink that began at his wrists and continued upward, the specific weight of a man who had spent his entire adult life being responsible for everything and everyone and was, in this moment, simply present. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the elevator mirror on the first night, like a man reading something he intended to memorize. "When this is done," he said quietly, "I'm going to ask you something." "What?" she said. "I'll ask when it's done," he said, the corner of his mouth. That brief, precise movement that she had learned to read as the thing he allowed himself instead of everything he was holding back. "So you have a reason to need the word to come." She breathed. "That's not fair," she said. "No," he agreed, and let his hands fall and stepped back and picked up his coat from the chair. He walked to the door, picked up a second bag she hadn't noticed, smaller, dark, the kind that didn't announce its contents, paused with his hand on the door frame and looked back at her one time. "Lock this after Woojin and I leave," he said. "The second bolt, not just the first." Then he was gone. The gravel under tires, the sound of the engine fatting down the mountain road, the absolute silence of a house that had held two people and now held one. She locked both bolts. Changmin arrived in Seoul at dawn. The city was conducting its early morning in the particular way of a city that never fully stops, delivery trucks and joggers, and the first commuters, the infrastructure of ordinary life running its routines beneath the surface of everything else. He moved through it in a car without Woojin, driving himself for the first time in months, because what he was driving toward required a specific kind of solitude. He parked in Jongno and sat for a moment. The message had come through Mintak, of all people Mintak, whose defection from the council's unified position had been the development none of them had anticipated, and which had created the specific opening that made tonight possible. Single combat was an old protocol, older than most of the current council, rarely invoked because invoking it required both parties to accept its terms, and its terms were absolute. No legal recourse. No council intervention. The outcome final and binding. David had accepted. That was the piece Changmin was still turning over. David had accepted, which meant David had a confidence Changmin needed to account for. A man like David, a lawyer, a calculator, a man who researched his environments, didn't accept a protocol he didn't believe he could win. Either he had access to something that changed the equation, or he had been told something about Changmin's current condition that made him assess the odds in his favor. Someone had told him something. Not Mintak. Mintak's reversal had been genuine. Changmin had read him across 40 years of his uncle's table and knew the difference between a man switching sides and a man revealing the side he'd always been on. Not Woojin. Not Jay, who was currently navigating his own war with the council's ultimatum and had enough to carry. Someone else. He got out of the car and walked. Because here is what single combat actually means in the world Changmin occupies. It's not theater. It's not ceremony. It's a protocol designed for exactly this situation, when a dispute between parties has become a structural problem for the larger organization, and the organization needs resolution without institutional exposure. One representative from each side. A neutral location. What happens there settles everything. David had inserted himself into the family's business through Prosecutor Wu's office and through the council's internal fractures. By accepting the protocol, he was claiming standing as a legitimate party to a legitimate dispute, which meant someone inside the structure had given him that standing. And Changmin was walking back into Seoul to find out who, before the meeting happened, because walking into a room without knowing every variable in it was how men in his position ended up not walking out. He met Mintak at a coffee shop in Sadong at 6:15. Mintak was already there, already had coffee, already had the expression of a man who had made a decision at significant personal cost and was living in the immediate aftermath of its consequences. Changmin sat. "Who gave him standing?" Changmin said. No preamble, the specific efficiency of a man with a limited window. Mintak looked at his coffee. "Cho Rihin," he said. Changmin went very still. Rihin, 47 years old, second-tier council position. Sung Riho's preferred candidate for the vacancy that would open when Dasun retired in the spring. A man who had been, in every observable interaction for the past 6 years, a reliable and unambiguous member of the existing structure. "Since when?" Changmin said. 14 months, Mintak said. The same timeline as Prosecutor Wu's file. The geometry of it reorganized. Rihin hadn't been recruited by David. Rehan had been working with Wu's office independently for over a year, and David had found Rehan through the same professional network that had connected him to Wu, and suddenly the entry point wasn't Christiana at all. She had been the visible mechanism. The actual entry point was already inside. "Does my uncle know?" Changmin said. Min-tak looked at him with an expression that answered the question, and added a dimension to it that Changmin needed a moment to receive. "Your uncle," Min-tak said carefully, "has known about Rehan for 6 weeks." The coffee shop continued its morning around them. Cups and conversation, and the ordinary machinery of people beginning their days. Changmin looked at the table. His uncle had known, had said nothing, had held the council meeting that issued the ultimatum about Christiana while knowing that the threat wasn't her presence, but a fracture already running through the foundation, had used her as the visible problem while the actual problem metastasized in the background. "He wanted me to send her away," Changmin said slowly, "because if I sent her away and the structure still collapsed—" "You'd have nothing," Min-tak said quietly. "Nothing personal, nothing to rebuild toward. He thought he was protecting you." "He thought he was protecting the institution," Changmin said, "and using the protection of me as the story he could tell himself." Min-tak said nothing. The meeting with David was at 9. Changmin had 2 hours and 40 minutes, and a restructured understanding of the room he was walking into. He picked up his phone and looked at it for a moment, put it back down. He had told her not to use her main number. He had given her Woojin's instructions. He had said the word would come, and he had meant it when he said it, and he still meant it now. He thought about the green jacket over the back of a stool, in a kitchen that had smelled of her grandmother's recipe. He thought about what he was going to ask her when this was done. He put on his coat. "Thank you," he said to Min-tak. Min-tak nodded once. The nod of a man who understood the weight of the information he'd handed over and had decided the weight was worth carrying. Changmin walked out into the Seoul morning. The city moved around him in its ordinary configurations, indifferent and vast, and somewhere across it, a man with a lawyer's precision, and a year of preparation was waiting in a room that had been designed to end things. Changmin walked toward it. Not because he had no fear. Because he had something he hadn't had in 20 years of walking into difficult rooms. He had something to walk back out for,